Hello, today I want to talk about Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan. This is gonna be a very messy review probably because I haven't prepared anything as usual. But we could summarize this book as an exploration of the struggles of humankind against its own sexual nature, especially since the advent of agriculture and even more after sort of like Abrahamic religions took the nuclear family as a base for justifying many of its theological claims, and consequently attached sin to any form of sexuality which did not accord to the reproductive purposes of the era. This book is supported by many other texts. For me, it was a very personal read because it basically contains many of the conclusions that I had to come myself throughout the last 5 years in polyamorous relationships, and in a very sort of like easy to read form, very well contained, full of notes and evidence at the end of the book for anyone who wants to confirm the studies that are quoted. I also recommend the audiobook version in Audible. I alternated between one and the other, and part of it is read by Christopher Ryan, who has like a really nice voice. At least I recommend the prologue to anyone who wants to know more about the book, because even though the prologue is not written in the form that one would expect a science book to be written, it's more like an anecdote. I feel like this anecdote contains part of the main ideas of the book. For that reason, I think I'm gonna read it real quick, and then I'll read something else. One Maggie afternoon in 1988, some local men were selling peanuts at the entrance of the botanical gardens in Penang, Malaysia. I had come with my girlfriend Anna to walk off a big lunch. Sensing our confusion, the men explained that the peanuts weren't for us, but to feed the irresistibly cute baby monkeys, like those we hadn't yet noticed rolling around on the grass nearby. We bought a few bags. We soon came to a little guy hanging by his tail right over the path. His oh so human eyes focused imploringly on the bag of the nuts in Anna's hand. We were standing like cooing like teenage girls in a kitten shop when the underbrush exploded in a sudden simian strike. A full-grown monkey flashed past me, bounced off Anna, and was gone, along with the nuts. Anna's hand was bleeding where he'd scratched her. We were stunned, trembling, silent. There'd been no time to scream. After a few minutes, when the adrenaline had finally begun to ebb, my fear curdled into loathing. I felt betrayed in a way I had never before. Along with our nuts went precious assumptions about the purity of nature, of evil, as an uniquely human affliction. A line had been crossed. I wasn't angry. I was philosophically offended. I think that's enough. That's not the full prologue. It keeps going, but that sort of shows one of the things that this book attempts to do is precisely to disenchant readers from their religious connotations that humanity as a pretty much theological concept at this point has been given, and how that has sort of like affected negatively the way our societies are structured, since many aspects of our nature have been both regulated and policed throughout, especially since the 17th century, but throughout history after agriculture. It explores as well like the reasons why agriculture sort of like became a thing, and we went from hunter-gatherers to farmers, being there seemingly no benefit at the time for doing one thing over the other, since food was abundant. There was enough, and the diet of hunter-gatherers was more varied. Their life was also richer. Farmers became sedentary and had to work more hours to get only one type of food that was generally not the ideal type, and then also sort of like protect that land, and that started wars, and it's basically a snowball effect that created, or at least is believed to have created by um, Christopher Ryan in Sex at Dawn, also by Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens*, which explains much better this specific event, and by other more theoretical academic writers like David Graeber, that created sort of like the concept of property. So it was a move away from our nature. Now, this book is not telling you to return to your nature and become non-monogamous, which is the sort of like definitely the thesis of the book is that our nature is non-monogamous, and that treating sex as natural would sort of accord much better with the way we are constructed as beings. But it is more sort of like trying to raise awareness about that fact in order for whether you are monogamous or polyamorous to be self-aware and to not be extremely judgmental and blame yourself for living same because you have desires that do not accord to your own moral expectations for yourself, because those expectations are not realistic. Those expectations assume Genesis and the fall, and assume that there is sort of like an entity that is beyond you that expects from you more than you can give, or not more, just something that you are not. There is plenty of evidence of how much like one of the main efforts of this book is to portray how culture affects the truths that one society lives by, and in this case the sexual truths, but also gives examples on diet, like famously how, for example, in the West it's extremely unthinkable to eat spiders, but we eat crabs, which are water spiders, you would say. Like the shape is the same, like they are virtually the same when it comes to like gastronomical value, yet one thing seems like an aberration for us and the other one is completely natural. Similarly, when it comes to sex, there are loads of evidence and instances of cultures that see sex as natural. He gives an example he gives several examples of tribes still existing nowadays that, for example, don't not that use sex as another sort of like social trait, and even that do not recognize the since they don't have sort of like a biological understanding of reproduction, they believe that all the people that has sex with a female before she gives birth are giving parts of themselves to the child. That means two things. On the one hand, it means that she will want to have sex with the best hunter and the best recollector and the best chef and the smartest, and so that the kid would sort of like absorb all of those qualities, right? That's a different mystique from the one that we have with Christianity, that is not based in resentment and self-loathing when it comes to sex, but rather in sort of like an exchange of value. In this case, what I consider to be a positive exchange, because both of the parts gain something, and it's much more self-affirmative in that sense. On the other hand, it also means that the child is supported by multiple members of the tribe. On that line of argument, there is a book I really like called Where is My Tribe? ¿Dónde está mi tribu? In Spanish, by Silvia Olmo or Elvira Olmo. I think if you just write something Olmo, if you just write "What is my tribe," you'll find it. Otherwise, I'll leave several links, both of introductions by Christopher Ryan and by Taurus Poli, who is another podcaster who gave him a nice interview, and also to a documentary called Monogamous, which is also a nice introduction to this whole text. But yeah, so what is my tribe? It's a book on maternity that explores how, like, when before the existence of tests and contraception, of tests of paternity and contraception, all the members of the tribe had similar likelihood of, or most of the members, since people tend to have sexual intercourse with multiple members of the tribe, they all had sort of like a paternal duty towards every single children in the tribe. The reason why the book is called "Where is my tribe" is because the principal thesis is that was extremely rich for the children of the tribe, because they would be able to learn many different skills and forms of knowledge from the many different members of the tribe, which would have a variety of things to offer on that subject. In that sense, our state as monogamous is sort of like limiting the capacity of children who have an insane brain plasticity to learn more than they could, precisely because of the limited family structures in which we live. Another sort of like a more biological argument for non-monogamy and the naturalization of or normalization of sex. And by normalization, I mean that yes, sex is still not normalized. Sex is seen as abnormal. Only one form of sex is sort of accepted within our society, and even that form is sort of like meant to not be mentioned in public, unless someone wants to cause extreme tension and discomfort on the people sitting next to each other. But yeah, another thing is that sort of like there's a clear correlative between the descent on fertility, immunity, and just general health of individuals, and the nuclear family and monogamy, because before sort of like there's this that sort of like you have the Darwinian belief of competition, right? Is that competition of the fittest before or after the conception? The argument is accepted is that in non-monogamous societies, people would not compete so much for who sleeps with the woman that's ovulating, but it would be a competition, a seminal competition, a competition of sperm, the sperm competition in that sense, in which the fetus would be normally the one who tends to inseminate the ovule, precisely because his sperm is the healthiest. Thus, the DNA, the genes that will be passed on to the next generation would always be the healthiest throughout the tribe. Of all the people who slept with her, it would normally be the healthiest, the one who has the best sperm, the one who would be able to reproduce himself more than others. That is positive because it is a sort of like an ascendant health. It gives us like an ascendant health sort of like graphic, rather than the nuclear family, where by sort of like monopolizing or centralizing reproduction into like a single man with a single woman, men with like extremely poor sperm and genes will still pass their genes on to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. This increasing and exponentially their specific genetical disadvantages, being infertility or any sort of sickness or anything that would be sort of in evolutionary terms not propitious for a species to propagate. Obviously, that is. It is eugenics both ways to think about it in one way or the other. The difference is that precisely because non-monogamy is, and that's the thesis of the book, the natural way to relate to each other. you could say that nuclear families is the true eugenics in the sense that it's the one that is being forced. In the other way, you would naturally let the next generation to be formed by the individuals that were not by individuals that were not conditioned by culture, but by nature's own capacity to tell apart the good from the bad genes. But that is an argument that for me is not so relevant, because at the end of the day, like, we do live in a culture that we have accepted, and it is precisely our capacity to transcend our own nature what allows us to sort of like be at the peak, at the top of the food chain. But sometimes that is beneficial, and other times it's not. Clearly, in the case of the nuclear family and marriage, it has not been that the case. If Levi-Strauss in the Elementary Structures of Kinship explains how marriage, which came after the nuclear family, but still represents a significant part of our historical background and conditionment in social relationships. In the Elementary Structures of Kinship, Levi-Strauss explains and speaks about how marriage was basically an economical. It was the institutionalization of an exchange of women as a resource, a reproductive resource that would bring labor to farm land. So that's, you can already see how sort of like it has to do with land. Thus, it's agriculture is sort of like the trigger of all of this, and then female as being sort of like the reproductive device that is precisely treated as that, as a reproductive device that provides the labor that will farm that land. Thus, she will be exchanged from father to husband, giving in exchange lands. So the husband would give lands to the father in exchange for the wife. She would have nothing to do. There is a nice passage at some point in the book where they quote the famous Deuteronomy's passage from the Bible that says something like, a man shall not take another man's house, or another man's land, or another man's horse, or another man's wife. That is the status that the woman had, a possession that had a potential benefit. And that is part of the background and the moral base of monogamy. Yet, the book is not arguing for a moral duty to become non-monogamous as opposed to monogamous, but to acknowledge that nature, and to, if one is to continue living on a monogamous relationship, to accept the natural impulses that one person has, without blaming oneself or falling into Judeo-Christian narratives of sin, for example. I'm gonna search for some passages and read something else just to give you a sense of how the book is written throughout, because the prologue has this anecdotal structure that doesn't make it like perfect. Here, for example, it's quoting like from Marco Polo, and this is an instance of the Mosho tribe, which was a tribe that saw sex in a different way as Christianity saw it, and how sort of like that was so so shocking for Marco Polo when he arrived and met them. I'm reading this because I've got like someone questioned me the other day, or actually yesterday, on whether there were actually real examples of non-monogamy that were successful, and the answer is yes and no. No, because with globalization, and since the hegemonic culture was totally Christian and Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic, if you wanna use that term, it was forced into non-monogamous tribes to become monogamous. But before, and still nowadays, with indigenous tribes that haven't had yet that much contact with our culture, you can still see those examples. as well as something that I really like from the book is that also rescues bonobos as a counter-example to chimpanzees, because we've always used chimpanzees precisely because they accord more to our cultural prejudices. We rather accept chimpanzees and say that we are just as murderous and violent as them than bonobos and accept that we are just as sexually evolved as them. So I urge anyone to search studies on bonobos as well, or just read a book. Really, it's a really easy read. It took me a day. So yeah, this anecdote for this chapter is called Love, Lust, and Liberty at Louie Lake. I'm just gonna start from. I'm skipping all the quotes. Every chapter starts with some quotes that contextualize it and are quite interesting, but I'm just gonna skip them. In the mountains around Louie Lake, near the border between China's Yunnan and Sichuan's provinces, live about 56,000 people who enjoy a family system that has perplexed and fascinated travelers and scholars for centuries. The Moshu revered Louie Lake as the mother goddess, while the fountain towering over it, Gamo, is respected as the goddess of love. Their language is rendered in Dogba, the sole pictographic language still used in the world today. They have no words for murder, war, or rape. The Moshu's relaxed and respectful tranquility is accompanied by a nearly absolute sexual freedom and autonomy for both men and women. In 1265, Marco Polo passed through the Moshu region and later recalled their unashamed sexuality, writing, "They do not consider it objectionable for a foreigner or any other man to have his way with their wives, daughters, sisters, or any other man in their home. They consider it a great benefit, in fact, saying that their gods and idols will be disposed in their favor and offer them material goods in their abundance. This is why they are so generous with their women toward foreigners." Many times, wrote Marco Polo with a wink and nudge, a foreigner has swallowed in bed for 3 or 4 days with a poor sap's wife. This keeps going, but it's just to give I just wanted to give an example. I don't want to sort of like expand much more over it, but I think that the Moshu tribes is a really nice example of how both we had an instance of non-monogamy and also how we forced them into monogamy and yeah, and how it's going back to Lyotard and Adorno with sort of like the narratives of the non-identical and the unrepresentable, but it's basically that sort of like Western tendency to force the non-identical into identical, to want to put into words what is not possible to cognize and assimilate for our culture. Zizek famously spoke of tolerance, wrote about tolerance, and as not the belief that I understand you and therefore I tolerate you, but the understanding that I do not understand you and you do not understand me, but because of that I cannot use understanding to justify your existence. It's precisely that I don't understand you what makes me let you be. I think that in that sense, what Foucault would later call the will to truth of, or actually before, not later, but what Foucault would call the will to truth of the West, of the West, is an extremely fascist impulse that we have as a society. Yeah, I'm omitting the rest of the chapters. I think that was enough to give an example of what I was talking about. I just wanted to read one on promiscuity, but there is so much to say about this book, and I have prepared so little that I hope that was enough. The sex loan. Yeah, I'm just gonna leave it there. But this is just a compendium, like multiple instances, like overflowing amounts of evidence. Um, yeah, I think for anyone who is interested in the subject, this will provide multiple answers and also reference to other works to continue reading. And I came into polyamory not as not through books, but empirically. Only years after I was already in a non-monogamous relationship did I find out that there was even a word for that. So it's definitely, this takes a lot of work out of one's back by giving it everything already sort of on paper and with clear references that will sort of like give you multiple rhetorical tools to understand and to defend yourself. And I recommend this more than to anyone else, to people who is monogamous and wants to continue to be monogamous, because this is also an exploration on jealousy, and it teaches acceptance on that subject. It's not something that I am longer familiar with, and I think that part of the reason why I don't feel any jealousy at all is precisely because of the process of the last 5 years, in which I sort of went through multiple of these instances and acquired multiple of these arguments through different works. But it's really nice to see it all together in a single book. I am currently reading The History of Sexuality from Michel Foucault, and I was thinking, I think I'm just gonna make a video part for The History of Sexuality, because even though I can take separate passages and talk about it, I think that it deserves its own place, because it's an way more complex, but an extremely interesting book. I just want to emphasize before finishing with Sex Adon and Christopher Ryan that I highly recommend, if you're not gonna read a book, to just like go through the links. You will have like this book is the kind of book that can be heard, that can be listened to. You don't have to read a book. Just go and watch watch Monogamish, watch Christopher Ryan's interview. If then you still feel an urge of deepen more, then read a book. But you can learn a lot and gain a lot of knowledge and value only by looking at the links I will leave in the description. And of course this is it is in a way sort of like coming from the Rousseauian view of the state of nature, sort of like idealizing the past, but with that awareness, it is not idealizing the past with the ignorance that Rousseau had. It is idealizing the past aware of Rousseau and aware of Hobbes and aware of Voltaire and aware of like the multiple refutations to Rousseau. Is I think that after the Enlightenment, and despite of people like Rousseau and despite of people who wanted to enhance nature, we've been much more inclined to look at ourselves and our nature as as a weapon, as weaponized against ourselves, to see each other as self-destructive and extremely violent, and potential murderers or rapists and so on and so forth. And that is because even though it's counterintuitive, I believe that in many instances it's much easier to do that, to just say I am this horrible being in nature, than to question the culture that awakens those inclinations in you. The more repressed you are, the more likely you are to accord to that nature. The more you know it and accept it, the more free will you be to live by a different moral code and to be in harmony with your environment, both sexually and socially, in every single sense. So it is not a naive idealization of the state of nature. It's not Rousseauian in that sense. It's Rousseauian in the sense that it is definitely giving multiple arguments, scientific arguments, for a less biased look at our sort of most negative human or evil human inclinations as intrinsically natural, and giving attention to parts of to instances that were ignored precisely because it was preferable for the state, who was policing and managing our sexuality, that we thought that we were evil in nature, rather than that we looked at the state, that we looked at the religion and the culture that sustained the social structures on our environment, and question them. Because if we did that, then the masters would have to fall. For that reason, I think it's an extremely valuable book to look at the other side of what has not been spoken about. It also has very interesting critiques on Darwin's personal life and how his personal Victorian and prejudices and extreme sexual repression, biographically speaking, conditioned the way he wrote The Origin of a Species, The Descent of Man, and so on and so forth. And also several instances of how it has been how our studies of animals to justify humans' behavior has always been completely subjectified, and it has like the observers has an influence on the subject that is observing, and that influence has been continuously and systematically negative. And we have seen how we throw a bunch of bananas in front of a group of chimpanzees or bonobos or any animals of any kind, and then they start a war because we altered their environment in order to observe them. But when we look at them in their natural environments without altering those environments, then those less catastrophic predictions and forms of behaving of those animals become way more visible, and become way more they just gain a lot more weight. So yes, both science and our culture and our philosophical visions on our nature have been partial from the beginning, and that is what this book is trying to undo. Does it achieve that? I don't know, but at least it gives a lot of perspective. It's a really nice, if you want to do a counter read of this, or if you want to see what the book means by those sort of extremely pessimist views on nature, a less common book to mention, but that I think is a nice both counter read and an example of what the book is talking about, in terms of how one looks at himself and rather sees the negative than the positive. And even though I'm speaking about Bertrand Russell, but he was much more than that, and as an extremely smart person, he was also able to not be completely partial and to look at. But even him had to acknowledge and give extreme importance to, in his book or his essay on human nature. He actually have 5 essays on human nature, but I mean there is a book which collects them all. Yeah, and you can see how he's trying to speak of human nature, and he can't stop speaking about violence. Half of the book is speaking about violence, precisely because of that religious background, precisely because that's what we've been bred over and over and over and over, to point at away from the real subject and the real perpetrators of that myth. Yeah, I think this video is probably it's 34 minutes, I see, but probably 15 minutes is just rambling. I'm sorry. Have a nice day.